Hi guys, welcome to the next video of the Struts tutorial series. In this video we will see different ways of accessing the HTTP resources like servlet context, HTTP session, HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response objects. In Struts 1, servlet request and response objects are passed to the execute method, and using these objects we can even get servlet context and HTTP session objects. But in Struts 2, if you see, the action method doesn't have any parameter. So how to get these resource objects if necessary? And there are actually two ways of getting these resources. One is by implementing aware interfaces and another is by using the ServletActionContext class. Accessing resources by implementing aware interfaces is a form of dependency injection, where dependencies, which in our case are these resource objects, will be injected to our action class at runtime if we implement these aware interfaces. To access each of these four HTTP resources, Struts has provided four aware interfaces, and they are servlet context aware, servlet request aware, servlet response aware and session aware. Like for example, if you want to access servlet context object from within our action class, then we will implement servlet context aware interface and then implement its set servlet context method. And when an action is invoked, Struts will examine if the associated action class has implemented servlet context aware interface. If it has, then the Struts will call the action's set servlet context method and pass the servlet context object before populating the action properties and executing the action method. Now in this setter method we need to assign the servlet context object to a class variable, and after that we can access that servlet context object from any point in our action class. Now this is actually done by servlet config interceptor. Now this servlet config interceptor checks whether the action class has implemented any of the aware interfaces, and if it has, then it calls their setter methods to inject the resource objects to it. Okay, let's do the coding for getting HTTP resource objects by implementing the aware interfaces. We will use the same hello world action class and implement these interfaces. Let's add all the unimplemented methods. Okay, so these are the methods from the interfaces. Now we will do the coding in the setter methods. We will store the HTTP resource objects passed into these setter methods in our member variables. Okay, so now we got the resource objects in our class member variables. Now let's try to write some code to test these objects. Now for testing the resource objects, let's create another action method and name it as getResource using aware interface. This is just for our testing purpose. We first test the request object. For this we will just pass some name parameter in the query parameter, and we will try to access that parameter using the HTTP request object which we just got into our class, and try to print that parameter. Now let's test the response object. For testing response object, just set the response content type by calling it set content type. We'll set it as plain text. Now let's do a sysout to get this content. Now to test this servlet context object, what we'll do, we will just call its getServerInfo method. It will give us the server information. That should be enough for testing servlet context. Okay, now let's test the session object. What we'll do, we'll put some value into it using its put method, and then try to get that value by calling its get method and print it in the sysout. So session dot put, let's put a role as developer. Now let's do a sysout, try to get the role. Using its key. Okay, so now the code to test these resource objects which we got after implementing the aware interface is also ready. Now let's check the other way of getting these resource objects. I already told that there is one more way of getting these resource objects, and that is using the static methods of the ServletActionContext class. Now for getting the resource objects from the ServletActionContext class, let's create another action method, getResource, using ServletActionContext. This is again for our testing purpose. This is nothing related to getting the resources. inside this method we will use ServletActionContext class to get the resource objects. We'll call its getRequest method to get HTTP servlet request object. We'll store it in a local variable. Then call its getResponse method to get the HTTP servlet response. Call its getServletContext method to get the servletContext object. One thing which you have noticed that ServletActionContext doesn't have any method to get the session object. So what we can do, we can use the HTTP servlet request object and call its getSession method to get the session object. Let's try to do that. There is a difference between these two approaches. Here we are getting a session object in a map form, while here we are getting a session object as HTTP session. So there is a difference between these two. Okay, so now we have got the resource objects in local variables. Put it in one. Now generally the HTTP session object is created automatically by Struts if we use the default stack, that interceptor stack. Now we can test these objects using the code which we used for testing using the aware interfaces. So just copy that. We'll have to do some modification, but mostly the logic is going to remain the same. Here we'll put so instead of calling a put method we need to use a set attribute, and here instead of calling get method we need to call get attribute. Okay, now let's create the action elements for these two action methods. Return success. Let's create two more action elements. This is again just for our testing purpose. We will use aware for the aware interfaces, and we'll use servlet action context for the servlet action context class. Okay, now let's build this project. For testing the resource objects using aware interfaces, we will use aware action. So just append aware in the URL and pass name in the query parameter. Set. Okay, so we got the sysout from request object. We got the content type from the response object, we got the server info from the servlet context object, and we got the role from the session object. So all of these four are tested using the aware interfaces. Now let's try to test using the servlet action context object, rather class. Put it here. Okay, so you can see that we got the similar sysout from the servlet action context class as well. Both of the techniques are working fine, and this is it for this video. We will see some more stuff of Struts 2 in the next video. Thanks for watching.